Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to go over introduction to short stories, and then in a separate video, I will do a concept video going over the short story by Ernest Hemingway called Hills Like White Elephants. So, to jump into and get started, what is a short story? It is considered a work of fiction or nonfiction that is under 20,000 words in length. It can usually be read in one sitting, and it begins close to the height of the action, which we call the climax, and it is limited in scope and action. So, meaning it's only going to focus on one plot line. There's not going to be any subplots or anything like that. So, when we're looking at analyzing fiction works, there are 7 different elements that we look at. That's going to be the plot, character, setting, point of view, language, including the style and tone, any symbolism, and the themes. And we'll go over these more in depth and then look at some examples. All right. Stages of plot. So the stages of a story's plot are the exposition. This is usually in at least a longer piece of fiction where we get the background of the characters, their relationships to each other, usually the first 1 to 2 chapters of a novel, where we start to really see who is our protagonist, what are they going through, how are all the characters related to each other, except for any that we get introduced to later in the novel. In a short story, we kind of get a tiny bit of this intro of who our characters are. We may not get the full background and relationship of the characters, though, and we kind of start right into what the conflict is. So the conflict is the problem around which the action revolves. It is the problem that will keep the protagonist from getting what they want. Now, it doesn't always mean that the conflict is going to be something bad. Usually it is in fiction, but it could be something good that just, you know, stresses the character out. The conflict also doesn't have to be human conflict, such as man versus man, protagonist versus antagonist. It can be things like human versus nature. Think of Jack London's The Wild. It can be human versus the gods. It could be human versus themselves. So there are many different types of conflicts that protagonists might face. We might also have some complications or crises that are events that enhance or move the conflict, keep the action, continuing. And all of those complications and crises happen during the rising action stage. So this point here where the beginning exposition starts to turn into the rising action, this is where we're introduced to the conflict, which is about where we start with, we probably start between here and here for a short story to have our beginning, so that way we can get straight to the action of the conflict itself. And the rising action is really just the building of the conflict leading up to the middle point, which would be the climax. This is the moment of greatest tension in which the conflict comes to a head. What that turning point, as you can see, into our resolution. So maybe that's the major thing the character's been dreading, the big battle. It could be multiple different things depending on the type of conflict that we have. Then the falling action in a novel usually will have a little bit more space for the falling action as it leads to the resolution. Obviously, in a short story, we don't have as much space to kind of get straight to the resolution, which is the end of the story, where usually the conflict is resolved, and if there is a moral to the story, that's where it is revealed. Now, as we'll see with some short stories, um, even with some longer fiction, the moral isn't necessarily right out there for you to see. Or even if we think about when we go through The Hills Like White Elephants, we don't know what the specific message is that Hemingway is trying to portray. It's not clear. We're not even quite clear. We know that the conflict's resolved, but we're not clear how it's resolved in Hemingway. Now, with plot lines themselves, usually this follows a linear plot, beginning, middle, end. But sometimes we have non-linear plots where they don't proceed chronologically, beginning, middle, and end. In these cases, they're called non-linear, and they may include things like a flashback, which moves events out of sequence to explain what happens in the past. So you're going along and something happens in the story that's related to something that happened before the beginning of the story. So we go back and tell what happened before the beginning of the story and then go right back to our normal spot. That would be a flashback. A flash forward, these are not as common, but sometimes they move events out of sequence to explain what will happen in the future, such as um, you'll see things like prologues that will say this is the event that's going on, and then it goes back to what's technically the beginning, and it eventually leads up to the action that the prologue was describing. Foreshadowing, we do see a lot of, especially in mystery and type stories. It suggests what will come through clues or hints. You'll see this with Poe as well, or any horror film sometimes, or horror story. Sometimes the author will leave little clues and tidbits that let you know something bad is going to happen, or in some stories that something good is going to happen to our character. With a short story, when we say that we are beginning right near the climax, we call it in media res, which is just Latin for we're beginning in the middle of events, which means that in a short story, we leave the reader to fill in the blanks. And a lot of stories, even not just short stories, but a lot of stories start kind of in the middle of the character's life. We don't usually see a story from the beginning of the character's life all the way to the end of the character's life. It is kind of just a pinpoint in time of that character's life experience. Now, we might get some flashbacks to when the character, prior to the story that help us fill in the blanks. We might even in epilogues get a little bit of information as to what would happen to that character, but we don't always get a lot. All right, speaking of characters, so we have first is the protagonist. Now, the protagonist is going to be our main character that we follow throughout the particular story that we're reading. And we don't say like good guy, bad guy, because a protagonist is the character we follow. They may not be a good guy. Think of if you like Marvel films, think of the TV show Loki. Loki is the protagonist. He's the one that we're following throughout the TV series. He's not necessarily a good guy. So, but we still follow him. It's conflicts that happen to him, and there's usually antagonists that he has to deal with, which might be good guys, might be bad guys. Same way, heroes may not always be completely good guys. We'll see with Poe that we follow a not necessarily good guy, but he's our protagonist. So we call them the protagonists because they're the main character that we follow. Then you have the antagonists. They are the ones that are trying to keep the protagonist from reaching their goal. And as I said, like with many different types of conflicts, there are many different types of antagonists. Again, the antagonist might be the good guy in our moral sense, might be a bad guy in a moral sense. It might be a force of nature or a supernatural being. It doesn't always have to be a man versus man. Sometimes even the antagonist could have self um, implications, like the protagonist versus themselves. We'll see a little tiny bit of this with the yellow wallpaper as the character fights with the descent into madness. So there's definitely a little bit of antagonistic force of her own mind. Now, besides them, we also have what we call foils. These are side characters which highlight something about the protagonist. In short stories, we don't get as many because that would lead to potential subplots. But as you will see in things like The Story of an Hour, there are characters sometimes that they're there, they don't play a big role in the story. They're kind of um not very well defined, not very much a changing character like our protagonist, but they help highlight something about how the protagonist should act, or maybe how we should perceive that protagonist. So, those are our three types of characters. In a story, we also define our characters by how well drawn they are. So, the first two contrasting ideas as to how we draw our characters is based on how well drawn they are. A flat character is a barely developed or stereotypical representing one character trait. So, for example, a character who is meant to represent good or bad, and they don't represent anything else. They don't have both good and bad traits. That would be a flat character. They're stereotypical, so they might represent an archetype like the fairy godmother or the wizened old mentor. Maybe they don't have any other characteristic traits to them that make them a well-rounded character. A round character is well developed. They have both good and bad traits. So they're going to have their really good things about them, but they're still, whether they're human or not in the story, they're still human in the fact that they have flaws. The other set of contrasting characteristics we have are whether the character is static or dynamic. If it's static, it means that the character does not change or is unable to learn from the events or any mistakes that they make. And dynamic is when the character is growing and changing throughout the story. They may have an epiphany or a moment of realization where they learn from the events or any mistakes that they've made. And for any of these characteristics, it doesn't mean that usually the protagonist is the best, most round dynamic character there is, or that the antagonist is, or that the foils aren't. But traditionally, the protagonist is going to be more round and dynamic than the antagonist or the foils, but it doesn't mean again that they have to be. So, for example, in the play Hamlet, if you've never read it before, it is about a young prince whose father has been murdered by his uncle, and he has to try to figure out and prove that his uncle killed his father. So he goes through a lot of different self conflict as well as conflict against his uncle throughout the story of Hamlet. Well, Hamlet is very flat. He's a very stereotypical character. He is not the best of characters, but he is our protagonist. He's also not dynamic. He's very static. The mistakes that he makes, the problems that he faces, he doesn't learn from them. He pretty much feels justified in his actions from beginning to end of the play. Now, we have other characters who definitely are not like that. We have round, well-developed protagonists. We have dynamic protagonists. You might have a round static or a flat dynamic. It just depends. All right. Also important to the story is the setting. And there's three parts to a setting of a story. And that's whether we're talking about short stories, long stories, anything like that. So first part of the setting is the historical or chronological setting. So this is when in time the story takes place. This is important because we might wonder, well, why didn't the character just do insert something modern? If you think, well, why didn't the character just do this? For example, Romeo and Juliet. Why didn't Romeo just text Juliet to find out what was going on? Or Friar Lawrence? Um, but because the story of Romeo and Juliet is set in the 1400s in Venice, we know cell phones were not around at that time period. So if we know the historical setting, it not only helps us understand why characters take certain actions, but it also helps us understand the story itself better. If we can understand, we had talked before about the history that goes on at the same time a story is written. Well, we can also think about the history that's going on at the same time the story is set and think about how the characters would react to different events. We also have the geographical setting, where on Earth the story occurs, if it occurs on Earth. This can change because obviously different cultures, different countries have different ideas, different countries might have different things going on at different times. So, for example, the French Indian War in the Americas in the late 1600s, early 1700s, those would have impacted the French, Native Americans, the English, and the Americans, not really the Spanish, not really the Netherlands, the Chinese, all these different other countries and cultures wouldn't have been affected by the Native American and French wars against the Americans and English. So if you have a story set in China during that same time period, they might have heard about the wars, but it's not really going to affect the characters or the setting or the events of the story. Then we also have the physical setting. This is where, in particular, the story occurs. So, for example, a room or a house, or when we see Midsummer Night's Dream in a forest, that lets us know the physicality of the place the character is at, how they interact with everything they're going on. So each element of setting is important in determining why characters behave as they do, whether their behavior is appropriate for the place and time of the story, and helps us understand what's going on in the story a little bit better. Now, when we have a short story, there can be a multitude of settings, but because it's usually focusing on one action, one short plot line, it's probably going to have one setting. It's usually going to have one historical chronological setting. It's usually going to have one geographical setting, maybe more than one physical, but definitely more likely to have one physical setting. If you have a longer novel, like when we read Frankenstein, it's the same historical chronological time period. It does take place, the story does take place over a few years though, but it has different geographical settings and different physical settings because it's a longer story. All right, the next part that's important is the point of view, or how we see the story, through whose eyes we see the story. So we might have a first person narrator, which would be either a major or minor character. So it might be our protagonist whose eyes we see the story through, someone intricately involved in the action of the story. We'll see this with the yellow wallpaper, with Poe's story, The Cask of Amontillado. But we also might have a minor character, someone who is a foil or only observing the event. Think of, if you've ever read The Great Gatsby before, the main character, Nick, is not the main character. We see through his eyes, but none of the events directly happen. He witnesses things, but none of it directly involves him. It involves the story of Daisy and Gatsby and Daisy's husband. We also, when we have a first person narrator, we have to think about the story and what they're telling us, because we're seeing through their point of view, which means we're very limited. We only see what the character knows. So there might be other things going on in that story that the character doesn't know about. Or there may be reasons that the character tells us something in the way they perceive it, or they purposely tell us a false narrative, either to make themselves look better or, for different reasons. And I know I say this like as if the character has control over the story when it's obviously the writer, but it's the idea of when we're being told the story through the eyes of a character, We have to think if we can trust that character or not. Are they being reliable, that we can believe his or her version of events because she or he has no reason to be dishonest? Or are they an unreliable narrator where we cannot believe the way she or he tells the story because maybe they have a bias, maybe they have maybe they're unstable, or you know, to use the term lightly, crazy, or maybe they're going through something that changes their perception of events. Um, Maybe they don't know the real story, maybe they're confused. So we'll see this in several of our stories this semester. We'll be focusing on some unreliable narrators so that you can see the difference between them. We also have a third person narrator. So this one is there's a couple of different characteristics with them. A third person narrator might be omniscient, so they know all, including the actions and thoughts of every character within the story. This is rare because it sometimes we want to not just be told, well, this is what this character's thinking, and this is what this character's thinking, and this is what's going on everywhere, because that ruins the ability of you as the reader to discover how the events are unfolding as the characters themselves do. And sometimes it's better to not know what everyone's thinking at the same time. But we do have some stories that are like that where we get a partial omniscient narrator. If you've ever read Game of Thrones or any other story that tells the story from multiple points of view, Rick Riordan's Egyptian mythology series also does this, where some chapters are from the brother, some chapters are from the sister. In that one chapter, we don't get everybody's point of view. However, the fact that we see the story play out from multiple points of view shows that the narrator is more omniscient. Same way with Game of Thrones, that sometimes are multiple characters whose points of view we see the story through, and it allows us that the whole story as a whole is omniscient, even though each chapter is more limited. More commonly, we get a third person limited, where the narrator focuses on one character and we know all that character's actions, emotions, maybe even their thoughts. So that way we can kind of understand why that character does what they do, how they react to others. We can see what they're thinking at that time period. And it usually will be like, well, Tyrion does this. So that's where it's third person, is we're describing the character in third person, even though we know them very intimately. Then occasionally you have a third person narrator who's objective. These kinds of narrators are basically like a fly on the wall. It's the narrator revealing only what can be seen by an observer. So the character's thoughts, emotions, their motivations are not going to be revealed to us. We don't know everything that's going on. We have to kind of fill in what's going on. We don't know more than the narrator knows, nor does the narrator know more than we do. All right, language. So this is how the author's using their words to create a style and a tone. Style is the way the author arranges words and uses vocabulary to express ideas. This may include formal style, where they're adhering strictly to the rules of English usage. They have elaborate sentences, a high vocabulary, a serious tone. It sets up the narrator as an expert. You'll see this a lot, especially in the early 1900s novels of the time period, where people were writing to show their intelligence, especially during the early 1900s or late 1800s, going into the early 1900s. You have more minorities, including women, who are writing at this time period. So a lot of women and minorities are trying to write higher to prove that they are just as educated as white men who have been to college or at least been to normal school, and they're trying to prove themselves. And then you also have kind of the opposite, where the white male authors who have dominated the literary scene are trying to prove, well, we're still more advanced as writers than these minorities. So we want to show how intellectually superior we are. So they use a lot of high language and vocabulary, very formal styles. Informal style is when they use everyday speech. They might have short or incomplete sentences. They're not adhering to all of the rules of English. They have a casual conversational tone. This helps set the narrator up as a peer, someone that you could connect to, and that you can connect better to the characters in the story. They might also use figures of speech such as metaphors and similes. The only difference between those two, obviously both a metaphor and a simile are going to compare two things that are not really like each other, and you're going to explain why they are or how they are. The difference is that a metaphor is comparing two things without like or as. So using Romeo and Juliet as an example, in the famous balcony scene, right before the famous balcony scene, Romeo is watching Juliet at her balcony and he says she is the sun. And that you could tell he's comparing Juliet to the sun by saying she is the sun, but she's not using like or as, or he is not using like or as to compare her that way. A simile would use like or as. So my love is like a red, red rose. That's a famous line. Shall I compare thee to a summer day? You are as beautiful as, you got that as in there. You've got the like from my love is like a red, red rose. That would be a simile. Alliteration, we see this more in poetry, but it is occasionally in stories, even things like comic books. A lot of Marvel characters have alliterative names like Peter Parker. It all that means is that the first sound is repeated in the next word or the next set of words. Personification is when we give human-like qualities to non-human objects. So like the leaves danced in the breeze. It just gives a different type of image to the same thing that we could say, well, leaves rustled or leaves moved in the breeze, but it gives a much different sense of imagery to say they danced in the breeze. Obviously, we know leaves don't dance like humans do, but it just gives that imagery for us. Now, tone is the attitude of the story as created by the author's words. The tone is how you believe the author treats their subject. The mood is what you are supposed to feel from the way that characters, from basically the events. If it's a sad story, like The Fault in Our Stars, we're most likely going to be sad as well. And part of that is if the author has the right tone towards their subjects, so like in a sad story, they're very sympathetic towards their subject and their characters, then and their word choice is meant to create a mood of sadness or a mood of happiness, depending on what kind of story, or a mood of anger towards something. All of that changes and manipulates our emotions. And a lot of that is expressed in the language of emotion. So if we can tell that the characters are feeling great emotion and we've been able to connect with it because the narrator is allowing us to connect with the character, then we feel those emotions with the characters. And a lot of times the tone is gleaned not just from the language, but through the story's events and the characters as well. All right. Symbolism. So this is when we put something within the story that represents something bigger than the item itself. So you have a couple of different things with this. You have symbols themselves, allegory, and myth. Symbols can be people, objects, or events that represent something in addition to their literal meanings. An archetype is a form of symbolism. So there are three types of symbols. You have universal ones, which are related to basic human and natural experience. So something like universally, we see red roses as a sign of love, um, rainbows as a sign of peace, um, the dove as a sign of peace. So basically, you have could have a dove in a story, a beautiful white dove, and it means both the fact that there is a white dove in the story and that it is a symbol of peace. The same thing, a red rose could mean both that there is a red rose and as a symbol of love. You have cultural ones and conventional ones which are related to the ideas of a particular culture or group. So, for example, if you have an American flag in a story, that might be representative of patriotism to America, whereas someone else might not, who is from another country, might not pick up on that symbolism, or might not feel that symbolism. There are also symbols that are specific to different cultures. So, for example, in ancient Greek myth, you had the symbol that the dove was a symbol of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, or the peacock was the symbol of Hera. To the ancient Greeks, a story having a peacock in it, that would be a symbol of Hera, or a dove would be a symbol of Aphrodite. But to the ancient Japanese or Chinese or ancient indigenous peoples of the Americas or of Australia or of different places, they would not see those same symbols. It wouldn't mean the same thing to them. Then you have specific symbols. These are created by the author for the purposes of the story. So think of like the Mockingjay from Hunger Games. It is a specific symbol throughout the story that plays a part in that story. There are many, 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 many different authors who have created symbols that are specific to their story, and it means something bigger within the story itself. So allegories are rather than just a specific person, object, or event representing something else, it is where the whole narrative has characters which, and the narrative and the characters themselves personify ideas, concepts, or philosophies. And the allegory, like the symbol, has two levels of meaning. You have the literal, what is actually happening in the story, and the figurative, what the action means in an intellectual and thematic sense. My favorite example of this, I grew up reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from the Chronicles of Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. And in that second book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, um, you have the story of the four children is the main thing, but when they meet Aslan and he teaches them about Narnia, and then you go into Aslan dying to protect the children and then being resurrected to help them in the final battle against the White Witch. Literally, that is what is happening in the story. Figuratively, because Lewis was a Christian, it was an allegory for him of the life of Christ and, teaching his followers, dying to protect them and save them from their sins, and resurrecting to help them and coming back, as Revelation says, come back at the end and help us in the final battles against evil. Another very basic form of allegory is the fable. So if you've ever read any of Aesop's fables, like the tortoise and the hare, or the lion and the mouse, where the mouse helps take the thorn out of the lion's paw, these have animals which represent humans and their character traits, and they're meant to teach some sort of lesson to humans. So obviously, like the tortoise and the hare, we learn that it's better to slow down in order to win the race than be fast. Um, you can learn many different messages from Aesop's fables alone or any of the different fables. And a lot of times there's symbolism relating to mythologies. These are going to be ancient stories that reveal the cultural mores of a group. And when it's called mythos, that is where it's including not just mythology of different cultures like ancient Greek mythology, but also the stories of religious backgrounds as well. It's not a claim that those stories are myth like Greek mythology, but it's saying that they can have the same effect, and they're both connected as the cultural more stories that reveal the cultural mores of a group. So a myth is a story that is central to a cultural or religious group. They embody a set of beliefs that unify individuals with a particular group and its values. And to understand the use of myth, the reader must understand the original myth which the writer is referring. So if the author makes a reference to a snake in the garden, if you know the story of the snake in the Garden of Eden and the original myth of Adam and Eve, then that reference makes sense. The same way if you say, we'll see a poem that to mute Philomene, you would have to know the story, the Greek myth of Philomene and her sister in order to understand what is being referenced to in that line. And finally, theme. So the theme of a story is its central idea or message. And sometimes a story may have multiple themes. Again, just like I said in the first video about literature in general, is that we all bring our different perspectives, our different backgrounds to literature. So two people might read the exact same story and get different messages out of it, different interpretations of what that story is supposed to represent. So these are just some common themes in short fiction, but again, there are many themes, and the story itself may have many themes in itself, as we'll see as we go through some of the themes of the different stories. So one common theme is coming of age or initiation. It's usually a young person learning lessons that move him or her from innocence to experience, or maybe from childhood to adulthood. So that's where it's coming of age, is it's either a literal they come of age, or a more figurative coming of age of going from a place of innocence to experience. Human versus nature is a common theme in which natural events such as storms or disasters threaten the character's abilities to cope with life. Human versus God or the gods, depending on the story, is where a character questions the role of a higher power in their lives. Human versus society, an individual's life is affected by the larger forces of other people or social conventions. And alienation, in which characters feel lost, alone, or disconnected from a common human experience. We'll especially see several stories this semester that have coming of age, human versus society, and alienation in them as we go through. But again, these are only a few of the infinite number of themes found in literature, but they are the most common ones. All right, the last part I want to do for this video is a brief example with a movie that I tried to pick one that was well known. I picked The Lion King. It is basically the story of Hamlet with a happier ending and lions. So if you don't know the plot line, it starts off with Simba being born. Scar makes his evil plans to kill his brother Mufasa, who is the king of Pride Rock, and he does it not quite in Simba's uh view. So Simba believes that his father died because of him, because Scar tells Simba that your father died because of you, even though Mufasa was killed by Scar. Simba runs away because he believes he'll never be accepted, because his father, in his mind, died because of him. Scar takes over as king while Simba lives in exile with Timon and Pumbaa. Nala eventually grows up. Nala is Simba's friend. She goes out hunting and finds Simba, now grown up, living with Timon and Pumbaa. And she has to convince him to stop this life of forgetting about the past and to stand up for his people, the other lions of Pride Rock, and take over his rightful place as king. And Simba has to wrestle within himself of, how do I overcome this guilt of my father dying and this pressure that will be put on me to have to face any consequences from what happened in order to push himself to fight against Scar, reveal the truth of what happened to Mufasa, and then take his rightful place as king. So there's a lot with that plot there. It's a very linear plot in the movie itself. Obviously, I picked a movie rather than a book just because it's a little easier, but you can see a lot of the same elements of literature can be analyzed in movies as well. We don't have a lot of flashbacks or flash forwards in the story, so it's very linear. We get some foreshadowing throughout the story, things like, um, obviously, in the song Be Prepared, Scar outright says he's going to kill Mufasa and Simba. However, the green flames and the blackness of his mane, all of these things let us know he's foreshadowing towards he's not a good character. Of the characters themselves, we can analyze them. Simba is round. He is our protagonist. He is both got good and bad characteristics about him that makes him a round character. He is dynamic though, because he goes from a child thinking of the way, of, oh, I want to be king and this is going to be awesome. My life is great, kind of the spoiled prince attitude, to learning from mistakes, learning from the past through the help of the actions of the other characters. And eventually he grows up and matures. Nala is very much a foil character. She shows the stubbornness and strength sometimes that Simba lacks when he is scared to face the past. But she has her good and bad characters about her, but she doesn't really change that much throughout the story. So she would be considered static. Timon and Pumbaa are also foils. They're kind of our comedic relief characters in a way. Um, they are, and because of that, that makes them more archetypes of the fool character. So because they're archetypes, they're very flat characters in the fact that they, yes, have their good and bad traits about them, but they're not well defined, at least in this first movie. So we don't see a lot of necessarily varying characteristics and backgrounds to them. And, but even though they are archetypes, even though they are flat, one could argue that they are dynamic in a fact of they go from being cowards who only think of themselves to, in the very end, changing to help Simba regain his kingdom. Rafiki is a true archetype because he is the wizened old mentor. We don't get a lot else about him. He doesn't have a lot of characteristics that make him a well-developed character, so he would be considered a flat character. He also is static because he doesn't change throughout the story. He very much sticks to one point of view. The same thing Zazu, again, the royal advisor, he is very flat and static. The hyenas, the same thing, flat and static, but from a henchman point of view of the archetype. Scar, there's really not good qualities about him, so he would be a flat character because he's not well-rounded and well-developed. He's also static as well because he doesn't change. He's evil throughout the story. He doesn't learn his lesson. Sarabi, Simba's mother, is just meant to represent the mother figure. Again, flat and static. Mufasa is also flat and static, not just because of the wildebeest that pound him and kill him, but because of he is the opposite of Scar. He is representative of good, whereas Scar is representative of evil. But also because he dies so quickly in the film, we don't see a lot of good and bad characters. He's not well-rounded. He's just a king figure archetype. Same where Scar is just the bad guy archetype of evil. And Mufasa doesn't really change beyond being alive and being deceased in the story. Now, the setting we can talk about, we don't really know the chronological time period because we're not given that part, but we know it doesn't really matter because it's an animal world. It doesn't matter what time period. We know the geographical setting is going to be Africa because that's where most lions are. And for physical setting, we get a couple of different physical settings throughout the story. Obviously, the most important physical setting would be Pride Rock, which is, the home of the lions and the seat of the kingdom. Then we have the kind of rainforest type home where Timon and Pumbaa live, and then a couple of different scenes in between of different places, like the elephant graveyard that the hyenas live in originally. So that all changes different individual places within the story. From the point of view, this one I would say is completely omniscient because we see what goes on with Simba throughout most of the story. We also see what goes on with Scar himself. We see what goes on to the lionesses while Scar is king, at the same time as knowing what's going on with Simba. So it's not really limited, and we can see the thoughts of Simba and the lionesses and Scar, so it's definitely omniscient. Language, well, it is a story meant for kids, so it's definitely going to follow more informal style language. It follows more language meant for children. It what doesn't follow as much of the type of language. Like I said, this is basically Hamlet with a happier ending and lions representing the characters. In Hamlet, the King Claudius, who is the uncle who murders his brother, takes over, but also remarries his brother's widow, Queen Gertrude. And so, but we don't see that happening here of Scar taking Sarabi as his mate because that's just too much to think about for children. We also don't go into real life lion politics where a new lion taking over the pride would kill the cubs. So there it's definitely language for children. But we do get a lot of symbolism. Some symbolism might be with water. So the fact that at the end of the story, once Simba has won, rains come in, rains that haven't been there, that has been a lack of water that has caused the land to dry out and become desolate and empty of prey for the lions during Scar's reign. Water finally comes through when the rightful king takes his place. Water also comes through and kind of washes out representative of washing out the evil that Scar had brought to Pride Rock. And then everything grows and becomes beautiful again. Pride Rock itself is symbolic. It's the home of the lions, but it very much symbolic of it even looks like the way a basic throne might look. The Circle of Life is, the original song that starts the film, but it is also something that Mufasa talks about with Simba, in that we see the Circle of Life played out on screen, that characters, even our favorite characters, will die, and then the next set of characters grows up and has to do. And at the very end of the story, we get that circle completing itself because the story starts with the birth of Simba and ends with the birth of his daughter Kiara. Scar is symbolic, just his name. Now, if you know any of the extended universe stuff with Scar and Mufasa, we know that Scar was not his original name. It's a nickname that he gained after having received his scar. But if you think about what a scar is, it is a wound that has healed, but not properly. There are still signs of it there, even though the original wound is gone. So clearly, it represents that something happened prior to the beginning. We know something happened prior to the beginning of The Lion King, because why would he have such animosity towards his brother Mufasa if it weren't for the fact that something happened between them? And whereas Mufasa has moved past it, like Scar's own Scar, that pain is still within him. He hasn't moved on. The skull that he holds in the second picture that I have on the screen, this is from when he is king and he is waiting for food to be delivered to him, and he has Zazu in a cage and he's playing with this skull while he's taunting Zazu. The skull is actually symbolic if you know the original play of Hamlet. So this is one of those, if you know the original mythos that is being referred to, you can get the, in this case, the joke, but the reference that the author is making. So in one particular scene of Hamlet, um, Hamlet is in a graveyard right before his famous soliloquy where he's by himself and he says to be or not to be. Now, when he gives us this soliloquy, he does not actually hold the skull. But prior to the soliloquy, when he's in the graveyard, he notices that someone is being buried and he holds up a skull of someone he once knew called Yorick. And he says, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well. And that is one of the famous pictures of many Hamlet productions is the young prince holding the skull. So this is representative of that in Scar is holding the skull. So anyone who knows that The Lion King is a Hamlet remake would understand the reference to the original material of myth. But if we think even further, not only is the plot a reference to Hamlet, because it is basically, like I said, a children's version of Hamlet, it goes back even further than that. Um, Not just to the story of Cain and Abel, but there are many mythological stories of cultures across the world of original stories of siblings who fought with one another. Obviously, you get the fact of Thor and Loki are adopted siblings in Norse mythology. They end up fighting with each other a lot. You get Cain and Abel, the famous story from the Jewish Torah as well as from the Christian Bible. And even in the Quran, the story is known of where the children of Adam and Eve, one is a shepherd, one is a farmer, and Cain and Abel are both bringing gifts to God, and Cain feels jealous that his brother gets more attention from God than he does, even though he feels he sacrifices more than Abel, and he ends up killing his brother to try to take over his place in God's eyes. So there are many different stories like this across mythologies across the world where sibling rivalry in for some kind of place, whether of affection or acknowledgement or of leadership. This is a common mythological reference that goes back, like I said, to ancient times as well as referencing Hamlet itself. Now, there are several different themes in the story that one could look at. Obviously, good versus evil is a big one. The biggest one from this story would be coming of age initiation, because Simba not only grows up in the story, but he goes from a place of innocence to a place of experience, witnessing his father's death, witnessing being exiled. There's a lot of that. Even Nala and the other cubs that might have been around, they have to learn about death at a young age because of Mufasa's death and learn about evil at a young age. There are many different themes elsewise that different people of different backgrounds might be able to see. Just the fact of the way that Scar treats not just the lionesses and those whom he has dominated, but also how he treats his own his own followers who have helped him to gain the throne, that sort of oppression. And so there are many different themes throughout the story. and it any new themes, someone watching this might interpret new themes still and be able to make new arguments about the story. So I hope that example kind of helps. If you've not seen the movie, I know it may not be as helpful, but if you've seen the movie, maybe it is. And you can see a lot of different themes here. Another symbolism I forgot to mention with this picture here, you have the fact of showing Simba's paws within his father paws print. It shows not only that Simba is still very small and doesn't understand the bigness of the world and the danger in the world that his father does, but it's very reminiscent of the phrase big shoes to fill, that there's a lot that Simba's going to have to learn, not just in growing up, but in general about the world before he can take his place as king. So hopefully this example helps. Hopefully going through the different elements will help. As you go through, I'll do a short content video to help with the short story paper next week. And a lot of that will show how you can use these different elements of literature to make arguments for your paper, both for the short story paper as well as for the final research paper. And the rest of this PowerPoint for the Hills Like White Elephants, I will make a separate video for, so be on the lookout for that concept video. All right, thanks and have a great day.